from MLS Power Sports. There's a lot of misinformation out there on the interwebs regarding the rear axles of Wildcat XX, and so we thought we'd make a quick video, show you some of the different versions, why they are what they are, and which one is potentially best for you. So first off, what the reason XX is different than other side-by-sides is part of what makes it so good, which is that the rear trailing arms swing straight up and down. That's different from most other cars that have radius rods and suspension swings in an arc. The upside of that is swinging in an arc, is it like Can-Am and Polaris do, is it allows for a simpler axle design. The downside is it simply doesn't work as well, so it gives more scrub to the rear suspension. XX has less scrub. That equals better performing suspension overall. Downside of that is the axle has to move in and out a lot farther. So that's what plunge is. Plunge is the ability of this axle to be longer or shorter depending on the needs. For one thing, this is a first generation XX axle. This was a takeout that came out of a long travel car. Everybody thinks that the factory axles are not double plunging. They actually are. This is the outer joint. You can see we have quite a bit of plunge there. The bulk of the plunge though happens here. And so within the CV on the inner side, the CV itself only allows for for angle and articulation. The bulk of the plunge happens in this section, which is called a ball spline. So I want you to understand what a ball spline means. So here's the same axle disassembled, no boot, so that you can see the ball spline. So you have two spline pieces, male, female. And then riding in each of these grooves is a series of roller ball bearings. So what that does is it allows that axle to be shorter or longer and use very little force to do that. So that's really good. It allows for the movement that you need, and it does it with very low resistance. So that's why that axle is designed the way it is. So let's talk about what was a problem for that. So the reality is, pretty much any inner boot design is just fine for the vast majority of people. So here in the eastern part of the nation, for trail riders, mountain riders, mud guys, whatever, this boot's a non-issue, and the reason is it moves through its range of motion fairly slowly. The folks who had trouble with the boot are the really high-speed guys, so desert racers, guys that run fast fire roads non-stop, where the suspension is articulating very quickly, and two things are happening. One, you got this huge expansion, as this thing expands and contracts through its plunge, compounded by the inner movement of the joint itself. So these early iterations have 9 ribs to the boot. Again, just fine for the vast majority of folks. So if you're a normal trail rider in the eastern US or in the mountains or whatever, this axle works great. You don't have any trouble with this. Later on, they came with this one. No change to the actual design itself. It's just a new boot that has 11 ribs instead of 9. So the idea being it could take the abuse better of that really high-speed racer type guy and not fold in on itself. So in that super high-speed scenario, the boot could kind of fold over on itself and destroy the boot. So even though the axle still worked fine, it trashes the boot, and then contamination's a problem. This axle's fine for almost anybody. The most recent version, what has changed now, is what everybody's calling a triple plunge. It's really not a triple plunge, and it functions the exact same as the originals, but I will show you what's different here. So this axle looks very different. Really not a triple plunge. It's actually still a double plunge, just like it has been. The only difference is the ball spline moved from inside the inner joint to being separated in the midpoint of the axle. Still functions the same, still super low resistance, it works great, but it allows the inner boot to have less going on. So instead of having to deal with both angle and plunge, now it's just dealing with angle. The plunge is taking place here, outer's never been a problem. So for you high-speed desert types, racers, guys, even short course racers, this really wasn't a problem. But guys who are, blasting whoops all the time at really high speed, those are the guys who had inner boot problems. This axle is your solution. East Coast guys, not so much. And the reason is it would work fine for you. It's just more boot exposed in the center of the axle, which has the potential to get damaged. Still not likely. It's covered by the trailing arm. Not going to be a big problem. You know, you don't slam your axle into stuff all the time. But in the event that you do, you can damage this inner boot, which again could introduce contamination. Another thing we want to show you guys real quick is how a XX axle locks in the transaxle. Arctic Cat UTV axles have been different for a long time, and they have an actual locking mechanism. It's why we really prefer OEM axles to the aftermarket axles, even in sport and trail, some of the other machines. So most side-by-sides use an axle that only uses a snap ring. So what the snap ring does, you have the tension of the snap ring, you engage the splines of the rear differential or the transaxle, depending on what you're working on, and that snap ring expands into a groove, and that holds the axle in. Wildcat Cat takes that a step further in that they put these little balls, it's kind of hard to see, but there's a little ball underneath that depending on how it's actuated, there's a cam underneath that, and it can be actuated by pressing the axle in on sport, trail, and X, or by turning this hex on a double X, and it pushes that little ball out, which, so once the axle is engaged, it expands the spring with a much greater force than just the spring would have on its own. So on a double X, for example, we're in the unlocked position. You can see that's down. The snap ring would be over top of that, and this bolt, there are two of these. So one is flush, you don't ever touch that one. One is a cap head. That turns 45 degrees clockwise to lock, and when you lock it, the cam moves out, moves the ball up, locks the snap ring in place. To remove the axle, you go back the other direction, and I said 45 degrees, it's actually 90, and it unlocks, and that allows you to remove the axle. When some of these cars very early on were having the rear axles pull out, one of the issues we found was the snap ring groove. You can see it has a big opening, and we had a couple cars early on that was aligned so that the ball that holds it in place was in the opening, therefore defeating the purpose of having the locking mechanism. In newer versions of the axle, really anything after the first 3 or 4 months of production, they close that up so it's much tighter, and it's much less likely to be installed incorrectly either at the factory or by anybody else. So one more time, the 3 basic version, there's the 9-rib, sort of original axle. Those are still, you do not need to replace those. If you still have this axle and the boot is not giving you trouble, it's probably never going to, and you're fine. The newer 11-rib version, which is the exact same axle with a boot that's more capable of high-speed applications. That one came stock on a lot of the 2019s. Again, perfectly fine axle. I wouldn't stress about that one either, unless you're a super high-speed racer. In the newest version, which everyone thinks is triple plunge and is not, but again, the mechanics of the axle work exactly the same. It's just boot location that really changed here, which should alleviate any problems of those of you that are high-speed desert terrain guys that are struggling with inner boots. This is the axle that fixes that problem. Totally unnecessary and probably not even useful for a traditional trail rider. Thanks.